Welcome to Mark Carney's book club, where I go through and read his book chapter by chapter and tell you what it's all about. This video is going to go over the preface of the book. The book itself, I believe, was released in 2021, and this preface was written April 15th, 2022 in Ottawa, Canada. So he starts off the preface by describing how, as a G7 governor, he worked through a series of crises that all had a common cause, and that common cause was that the values of the market usurped those of humanity. Very in line with my anti-capitalist thoughts there. On our human nature, he says that we are far from perfectly rational. We tend to support past decisions even when new information suggests that they are wrong. He notes that we value the present more than the future, and so we're less likely to make investments today that will reduce risks tomorrow. And we definitely see that happening all across the board, whether it be in governments or in companies doing that as well and cutting corners. So he wrote this book during the first two waves of COVID and remarks on the optimism it brought him to see the response of Canadians and their willingness to help their community. To stabilize global temperature rises, we must reach net zero. Net zero means that our carbon emitted needs to equal the carbon taken out of our atmosphere. He comments that Canada is well positioned to move to a zero carbon electricity grid and electrify transportation and industrial processes, as well as turning hydrogen and carbon capture from concepts to commercial realities. My thoughts on that are, if you don't believe in climate change or science, you will wince at this because we're suggesting change here, but climate change is real and we must adopt new ways to do things if we want the earth to exist for our kids and grandkids. There's certain people who aren't going to buy it just because they don't believe in the fundamental science behind all of this, but I think more rational heads will prevail, I hope, and realize that we do need to make a change. Carney describes how he is the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance, and the goal is to put in place the information, tools, and markets so that every financial decision takes climate change into account. He chairs the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ, and this finances the net zero plans of companies and countries. He acknowledges there's no green switch we can just flip here, and he acknowledges that, and that transition is transition. He comments that financial institutions must go where the emissions are and commit to backing companies that have credible plans to transform to be net zero. He comments that we all have a role and we need to push for accountability. Even if you're an employee somewhere, you need to find out whether the company you work for has a plan for net zero, or does the management think that governments and people are bluffing with their net zero targets, and do they consider the company separate from society? And my comments on that would be yes, they do. They're not so focused on the collective good, and that is a problem, and I think that's what's being pointed out here, and he wants people to kind of see that. I thought this quote was funny. He says, "Ask not what the climate is doing to your country, but what your country can do for the climate." He then goes into the markets and says, given the scale of the climate challenge, we won't get to net zero without innovation, investment, and profit. And markets are the most powerful instrument we've ever created, but markets are also indifferent to human suffering and can be blind to our greatest needs. On Canadian leadership, he says that we must choose to be digital by design rather than digital by default, and sustainable transition isn't in 2050, it has to be right now. Another quote I'll read from the preface is, "When we're faced with huge challenges, it's tempting to deny that they're real. We don't deny our problems, we defeat them, and we build our tomorrow." And so that's the preface. Nice, short, gives a little overview of what to expect in the book. So let me know your thoughts on that. I do find I get kind of triggered when I hear people immediately dismiss him because he's a banker and, feeds into the system or has worked in private sector, because they just assume that his values are of that. And I think the reason I'm triggered by that is because I'm a CPA. I worked in corporate finance. I worked for the companies that are just all about profit, as did he, but on a much bigger scale, obviously. Just because you've been a part of the system doesn't mean that you can't try to make change and get out of that system. And I do see him stepping away from private sector and coming in at this time to help Canada. I don't think it's the most lucrative decision financially he could have made. And if he's all about money, he would have stayed just where he is. That's my opinion on that. And I'd like to say that, I'm a testament that people who have a background that would lend you to believe that they are just capitalism doesn't necessarily mean that that's where their true values lie. Take that how you will. Let me know what you think about that, and stay tuned because there's an introduction as well that I will go over next.